In July 1916, a woman collapsed in her son's Manhattan townhouse during an argument about money. She was 81 years old. She had not seen a doctor in years. The servants carried her upstairs to a borrowed bedroom. She owned no home of her own, and 2 days later, she died there, surrounded by family members who had spent decades waiting for this moment. Her name was Hetty Green. The newspapers called her the richest woman in America. Her estate was valued at over $100 million, equivalent to several billion today. She had lived the last 40 years of her life in rented rooms above groceries and cold water flats, in the corners of bank vaults. She wore the same black dress until it disintegrated. She ate cold oatmeal to avoid the cost of heating it. Her son had lost his leg as a boy, in part because she delayed medical care. Her daughter married at 38, only after Hetty's control had consumed the years when marriage might have mattered. Her husband died estranged, broken, alone. This is not a story about a woman who overcame. It is a story about what accumulation required, what it cost the people closest to her, and what it left behind when the counting finally stopped. The unease begins not with scandal, but with inheritance, and the moment Hetty Green decided that protecting money mattered more than anything it could buy. Hetty Robinson's father died in 1865, leaving her approximately $5 million. She was 30 years old. The money came from whaling, from trade, from New Bedford shipping fortunes, built over generations. Edward Robinson had been deliberate about his daughter's education. He taught her to read financial statements before she was 10, brought her into counting houses as a teenager, made her watch transactions and calculate interest. When he died, she knew exactly what she had inherited, down to the individual bonds and property deeds. Her Aunt Sylvia died 2 weeks later. The will left the bulk of the estate, another $2 million, to various charities and distant relatives. Hetty received a small sum. She read the document in a lawyer's office in New Bedford and decided immediately that the will was fraudulent. She produced another will. This one, dated earlier, left nearly everything to her. She claimed her aunt had signed it years before, in sound mind, and that the later document had been forged or coerced. The family contested. Hetty hired lawyers. The case moved into probate court, then superior court, dragging through depositions and testimony for years. The will she presented was almost certainly a forgery. Handwriting analysts would later suggest that Hetty herself had traced her aunt's signature. During the trial, witnesses described seeing Hetty practice her aunt's handwriting at a desk, over and over, late into the evening. She denied this under oath. The case consumed her attention through the late 1860s, pulling her into courtroom after courtroom, forcing her to sit across from relatives who now refused to speak to her. She did not need the money. She already had more than most families in New England would accumulate across generations. But the principle that someone else might control wealth she believed belonged to her was intolerable. The lawsuits became her daily occupation. She wrote letters to judges, reviewed depositions, appeared at hearings, consulted with attorneys about strategy. Her father's fortune sat in banks, accruing interest, while she spent years fighting for her aunt's. In 1868, she lost the case. The court ruled against her. She was ordered to pay court costs. She refused to accept the judgment and began planning an appeal. But her lawyers advised her that pursuing it further would only confirm suspicions of forgery and open her to criminal prosecution. She withdrew from New Bedford society entirely. The loss did not chasten her. It clarified something. She would never again allow someone else to decide what she was owed. She would never again be vulnerable to a courtroom, a relative, a contested signature. The only protection was control, absolute, personal, unshared. She began restructuring her inheritance, moving assets into her own name, severing any financial connection that required trust in another person. Her mother had died years earlier. Her father was gone. Sylvia was gone. She had no siblings. The extended Robinson family, once central to New Bedford's social fabric, now viewed her with suspicion or outright hostility. Invitations stopped arriving. When she walked through town, acquaintances crossed the street. She was 33 years old, unmarried, wealthy beyond measure, and increasingly alone. The isolation might have pushed someone else toward reconciliation, toward rebuilding relationships, toward using wealth to soften the social damage. Hetty did the opposite. She decided that relationships were liabilities. People wanted her money. They would contest wills, challenge agreements, make claims on her estate. The only rational response was to eliminate dependence entirely. She kept detailed records of every interaction that involved money. If someone borrowed $1, she noted it in a ledger. If a relative asked for help, she wrote down the request, the amount, the date, and her refusal. She began wearing plain black dresses, not out of mourning, but because they required no decision, no upkeep, no replacement. She stopped attending social events. She sold the family home in New Bedford and moved into a boarding house. Her financial strategy became equally defensive. She invested in government bonds, in railroad securities, in real estate mortgages, anything that produced predictable income and required no partnership. She avoided speculative ventures. She refused to join investment syndicates or trust other financiers with her capital. Every decision had to pass through her alone. By 1867, she had reorganized her entire inheritance into instruments she could monitor personally. She visited banks to check on her holdings, reviewed statements in person, demanded explanations for any discrepancy. The bankers found her exhausting. She did not care. She had learned that the moment you trusted someone else to manage your wealth, you gave them the power to take it. Men began proposing marriage. She was wealthy, unmarried, and from a respectable family. The proposals came from merchants, from lawyers, from younger sons of declining fortunes. She recognized every one of them as a claim on her assets. Marriage, under the laws of the time, would transfer her property to her husband's control. She would become legally dependent on his financial decisions. The thought was unbearable. She interviewed suitors like loan applicants. She asked about debts, about business dealings, about their own inheritances. Most of them left offended. A few persisted. One of them was Edward Henry Green, a wealthy trader based in the Philippines and later New York, a man with his own fortune and no apparent need for hers. She did not trust him either, but Edward was willing to do something the others were not. He agreed to sign a prenuptial contract stating that her wealth would remain entirely separate from his, that he would have no legal claim to her assets, and that their finances would never merge. The agreement was unusual for the time. Most lawyers considered it almost offensive, a repudiation of the basic structure of marriage. Hetty insisted on it. Edward signed. They married in 1867, a small ceremony with no family present. The marriage was functional, not romantic. They lived separately for months at a time. Edward managed his own investments. Hetty managed hers. They shared a name and occasionally a residence, but nothing else. The will contest had taught her what she needed to know. Wealth did not protect you unless you controlled it completely. Family did not shelter you unless you kept them at a distance. Love, loyalty, trust, these were points of vulnerability. The only safety was in elimination of dependence, of sentiment, of anyone who might make a claim. She had inherited a fortune meant to provide comfort, status, and security. Instead, it had made her a defendant, a suspect, and an exile. She responded by making herself untouchable. What she did not see, what perhaps no one could have seen in 1867, was that untouchable and unreachable were the same thing. Edward Henry Green had made his money in the Philippines, trading silk and tea, moving capital between Manila, Hong Kong, and New York. He was 46 when he married Hetty, 16 years older, with the kind of confidence that came from building wealth rather than inheriting it. He wore fine suits, he kept rooms at good hotels, he enjoyed cigars, dinners at clubs, the company of other financiers. In almost every way, he represented what Hetty had decided to avoid. The prenuptial agreement they signed was 8 pages long. It specified that all property Hetty brought into the marriage would remain hers alone. Any income generated by her investments would be hers. Edward would have no authority over her assets, no right to manage them, no claim in the event of separation or death. His own wealth would remain his, equally separate. The document essentially created 2 parallel financial lives within a single legal marriage. Hetty's lawyers had drafted it. Edward's lawyers reviewed it and advised him not to sign. They told him the terms were humiliating, that they undermined the basic structure of a marriage, that no man of his standing should accept such conditions. Edward signed anyway. He seemed to find the arrangement amusing, or perhaps he simply did not care. He had his own fortune. He did not need hers. But the separation of assets created a deeper separation. They kept separate bank accounts, separate investment records, separate correspondence with brokers and agents. When they traveled, they often took separate ships. When they lived in the same city, they sometimes rented separate lodgings. Hetty would stay in a cheap boarding house while Edward kept a suite at the Fifth Avenue Hotel. She ate oatmeal in her room. He dined in the hotel restaurant. Their first child, Edward Howland Robinson Green, called Ned, was born in 1868, a year after the wedding. Their daughter, Hetty Sylvia Ann Howland Green, followed in 1871. The children did not soften the marriage. Hetty managed their upbringing the way she managed her investments, carefully, suspiciously, with an eye toward preventing waste. She refused to hire nurses or nannies. She dressed the children in plain, inexpensive clothing. When Ned outgrew his shoes, she bought used ones from secondhand shops. She taught them to eat simply, to avoid extravagance, to understand that money saved was better than money spent. Edward watched this with growing discomfort, but rarely intervened. The prenuptial agreement had established boundaries, and he seemed reluctant to cross them. Hetty's distrust extended even to her husband's business dealings. In the early 1870s, Edward began investing more aggressively, moving into railroad speculation and leveraged positions in the stock market. Hetty disapproved. She considered speculation reckless, a way to lose fortunes rather than preserve them. She told him so repeatedly. He ignored her advice. Their arguments were not loud or dramatic. They were cold, transactional. Edward would explain an investment. Hetty would point out the risks. He would proceed anyway. She would note his decision in her personal ledger, as if recording evidence for a future case. The marriage began to feel less like a partnership and more like a mutual surveillance arrangement. In 1874, Edward's investments started to fail. He had overextended himself in railroad stocks, borrowing against his holdings to buy more shares, convinced the market would continue rising. When it turned, he was caught in a cascade of margin calls. He owed money to banks, to brokers, to business partners. His wealth, which had once seemed secure, began to evaporate. He did not tell Hetty immediately. He tried to manage the crisis himself, selling assets, calling in debts, negotiating extensions with creditors. But the losses were too large. By late 1874, he was insolvent. He came to Hetty and asked for help. She refused. The prenuptial agreement protected her assets from his debts, and she had no intention of breaching that protection. She told him that his speculation had been foolish, that she had warned him, that the consequences were his responsibility. She would not bail him out. She would not co-sign loans. She would not allow her fortune to be attached to his failures. Edward was stunned. Whatever warmth had existed between them evaporated in that conversation. He had expected perhaps that marriage meant something beyond legal documents, that in a crisis she would help him. She saw it differently. Helping him would mean exposing her assets to his creditors. It would mean risk. She had spent a decade eliminating risk from her life. She would not reintroduce it for sentiment. The creditors began circling. Edward's name appeared in financial journals, listed among those who had failed to meet their obligations. His reputation collapsed. Friends stopped inviting him to dinners. Business contacts refused to see him. He aged rapidly over the next year, his confidence replaced by something quieter and more brittle. Hetty watched this happen and did not relent. She continued managing her own investments, collecting her rents and interest payments, accruing wealth while her husband disintegrated financially. They still shared a legal marriage, but the emotional contract, if it had ever existed, was void. In 1875, fearing that Edward's creditors might find a way to make claims against her despite the prenuptial agreement, Hetty decided to leave the United States entirely. She took the children and moved to London. Edward followed later, diminished and dependent, no longer an equal partner but something closer to a financial refugee within his own marriage. The move was not presented as exile, but it functioned as one. Hetty settled the family into modest lodgings in London, far below what her wealth could afford. She enrolled Ned in a cheap school. She kept Sylvia at home, tutoring her herself to avoid the cost of a governess. Edward took rooms nearby but rarely joined them for meals. He spent his days trying to rebuild his finances from across the ocean, writing letters to American contacts, pursuing investments that never materialized. The children began to understand that their family was not normal. Other wealthy families lived in large homes, threw parties, hired staff, traveled for pleasure. The Greens lived like people in hiding. Ned asked his mother why they did not live like other rich families. Hetty told him that other rich families were fools, that they wasted their money, that waste was a form of moral failure. She was teaching them her logic. Wealth was not for living, it was for preserving. Comfort was a trap. Trust was a liability. The marriage had proven it. Edward had trusted the market, trusted his own judgment, and lost everything. She had trusted no one, and her fortune had only grown. What the children learned in those years was that wealth and deprivation could coexist in the same household, that a mother could be worth millions and still refuse to heat the apartment, that love, if it existed at all, was subordinate to the protection of capital. The boarding house in London was on a narrow street in Langham Place, near enough to the financial district that Hetty could walk to her bank, but far enough from Mayfair that the rent remained low. The rooms were small, poorly heated, furnished with the landlord's worn chairs and tables. Hetty paid month to month. She did not lease anything longer. Commitment meant liability. Ned was 7 years old when they arrived. Sylvia was 4. They shared a bedroom barely large enough for 2 narrow beds. Hetty slept in an adjoining room, separated by a thin wall. Edward took lodgings a few streets away, visiting occasionally but never staying long. The arrangement was presented as temporary, until Edward's financial troubles in America resolved. But months passed, then years, and nothing changed. Hetty enrolled Ned in a day school that charged minimal tuition. The other boys came from clerks' families, shopkeepers, minor tradesmen. They wore patched jackets and shared textbooks. Ned wore clothes his mother bought from street markets, already worn by other children, cleaned and mended, but obviously second-hand. The boys noticed. They asked why his family lived in a boarding house if his mother was supposed to be rich. Ned had no answer. He came home with questions. Hetty told him that appearances were for weak people, that real wealth was invisible, that the boys mocking him would die poor, while he would inherit millions. Sylvia did not go to school at all. Hetty taught her at home using old primers and exercise books she bought used or borrowed from libraries. The lessons were irregular, interrupted whenever Hetty needed to visit the bank or review her accounts. Sylvia learned arithmetic by watching her mother calculate interest. She learned geography by studying maps of railroad routes and shipping lanes. She learned almost nothing about literature, music, or art. The boarding house had a shared kitchen. Hetty refused to use it during peak hours when the stove cost extra to operate. She prepared meals in the early morning or late at night, oatmeal, boiled potatoes, bread, occasionally a small piece of fish. She cooked in bulk and stored the food in their room, reheating portions over a spirit lamp to avoid paying for the stove again. The room smelled perpetually of old cooking. Other tenants in the boarding house were lower middle-class families, clerks, a widow who took in sewing. They knew something was strange about the American woman and her children, but they did not know what. Hetty dressed like them, lived like them, complained about costs like them. She haggled with street vendors over pennies. She refused to tip cab drivers. She walked miles rather than pay for an omnibus. At night, after the children were asleep, Hetty sat at a small desk by the window and worked through her financial records by candlelight. She tracked every investment, bonds, mortgages, railroad shares, in ledgers she carried with her from New York. She calculated compound interest by hand. She wrote letters to her American bankers and agents, demanding updates, questioning fees, disputing charges. The candlelight was cheaper than gas lamps. She wrote until her eyes ached. Edward visited on Sunday afternoons. He brought small gifts for the children, a toy soldier for Ned, a ribbon for Sylvia, purchased with what little money he still controlled. Hetty accepted the gifts coldly, inspecting them for cost, making comments about wastefulness. Edward stopped arguing with her. He had learned that argument was useless. She had made her position clear in New York. His failure was his own, and she would not subsidize it. The children watched these visits with confusion. Their father arrived well-dressed, smelling of cologne and cigars, a reminder of a world they did not inhabit. He spoke gently to them, asked about their week, tried to create moments of warmth. Then he left, walking back to his separate lodgings, and Hetty returned to her desk and her ledgers as if he had never been there. Ned began to understand, slowly, that his family's poverty was a choice. He saw other wealthy Americans in London, families staying at the Savoy, attending theater, riding in private carriages. He understood that his mother could afford those things. He did not understand why she refused them. When he asked, she told him that those families were frivolous, that they would lose their fortunes within a generation, that discipline was worth more than comfort. Sylvia understood less but felt more. She had no friends. She saw other children playing in parks, walking with governesses, wearing clean new dresses. She asked her mother why she could not have a doll like the ones she saw in shop windows. Hetty told her that dolls were wasteful, that the money spent on a doll could be invested and grow. Sylvia was 6 years old. She did not understand investment. She understood only that the answer was no. The isolation deepened. Hetty made no effort to join London society, to attend events, to meet other American expatriates. She had no interest in socializing. Social life required spending on clothes, on entertainments, on reciprocal invitations. It also required vulnerability, the risk that someone might befriend her children, gain influence, make claims. She avoided all of it. In 1878, Edward's situation worsened further. His remaining creditors in New York obtained a judgment against him. There was talk of criminal charges, accusations that he had misrepresented his assets, that some of his transactions bordered on fraud. The specifics were unclear, tangled in legal language and transatlantic delays, but the threat was real enough that Edward could not safely return to the United States. Hetty saw this as vindication. She had been right to separate her finances from his. If she had helped him, if she had allowed their assets to merge, she would now be entangled in his legal troubles. Her wealth would be subject to seizure, to judgments, to the chaos of his collapse. Instead, she was protected. Her money remained hers, untouched, growing steadily in American banks while her husband fell apart in London. Edward stopped visiting as frequently. The gifts for the children became smaller, then stopped entirely. He looked older each time Ned saw him, thinner, grayer, his confidence replaced by a kind of silent endurance. Ned, now 10 years old, began to feel something close to pity for his father, and something close to fear of his mother. Hetty did not notice or did not care. Her focus remained on her accounts, her investments, her correspondence with New York. The exile in London was inconvenient, but it was manageable. She had her children under control. She had her fortune intact. She had eliminated every external claim on her wealth. What she had also eliminated was any life beyond the ledgers. The boarding house rooms, the cold meals, the second-hand clothes, the isolation, these were not temporary hardships. They were becoming permanent conditions, and her children were learning to live inside them, learning that wealth was something you protected, not something you used, and that the people closest to you were the ones you trusted least. In 1879, Hetty decided that Edward's legal troubles had quieted enough for her to return to New York. The decision was not about reunion or stability. She needed to manage her American investments directly. Correspondence across the Atlantic was too slow. She wanted to see her properties, meet with her brokers, review her mortgages in person. Edward could remain in London if he wished. The children would come with her. They sailed in March, third-class passage despite Hetty's millions. The compartment was cramped, shared with immigrants and working families. Sylvia was 8, Ned was 11. They spent 2 weeks crossing the Atlantic in a cabin that smelled of bodies and damp wool. Hetty told them this was how sensible people traveled. First-class tickets were for the foolish. When they arrived in New York, Hetty did not rent a house. She took rooms in a boarding house in Hoboken, New Jersey, across the river from Manhattan. The building was narrow, pressed between similar structures, housing German and Irish immigrant families. The rent was low. The neighborhood was loud. Children in the streets, vendors shouting, factories running through the night. Hetty considered it adequate. She enrolled Ned in a public school in Hoboken. The other students were children of factory workers, dock laborers, seamstresses. They spoke English with heavy accents, or didn't speak it at all. Ned, with his years in London schools and his careful diction, stood out immediately. The boys called him the little gentleman. and worse. He learned to fight, badly, and came home with torn clothes and bruised knuckles. Hetty mended the clothes herself and told him fighting was wasteful. Sylvia stayed home again. Hetty hired no tutor, enrolled her in no school. The girl spent her days in the boarding house rooms, reading whatever books Hetty brought home from secondhand shops, watching the street from the window. She was developing a quietness that would never fully leave her, a sense that the world was something observed, not participated in. Hetty's daily routine became fixed. She woke before dawn and walked across the river into Manhattan, carrying her financial documents in a worn carpet bag. She went to the Chemical National Bank, where she had maintained her primary accounts for years. The bank allowed her to use a desk in a back office, a courtesy extended because of the size of her deposits. She sat there for hours reviewing statements, writing letters, meeting with borrowers who came seeking loans. She had begun lending money privately, outside formal banking channels. Businessmen came to her when banks refused them, when they needed capital quickly, when they were desperate. She charged high interest rates, sometimes 10%, sometimes 15%, depending on the borrower's situation. She required collateral always: property deeds, stock certificates, anything she could seize if they defaulted. She kept the collateral documents in a safe deposit box and checked on them weekly. The loans were profitable. The risk was minimal because she only lent against assets worth more than the loan itself. If borrowers failed to repay, she foreclosed. She acquired properties this way: tenement buildings in Lower Manhattan, small commercial buildings in Brooklyn, parcels of land in New Jersey. She never visited them. She hired agents to collect rents and handle repairs, paying them as little as possible, disputing their bills, auditing their records. She returned to Hoboken each evening, walking back across the river to save the ferry fare. She bought day-old bread from bakeries about to close, bruised fruit from street vendors. She prepared dinner in the boarding house's shared kitchen after other tenants had finished, reusing their still-warm pots to save fuel. The children ate with her in silence, then went to their room. Ned began to rebel in small ways. He asked why they lived in Hoboken when his mother owned buildings in Manhattan. Hetty told him those buildings were investments, not homes. He asked why they couldn't live in one of them. She said living in your own property was financially inefficient. You lost rental income and tied up capital in consumption. He was 12 years old. He stopped asking. Edward arrived from London in 1880. He took separate lodgings in Manhattan, a modest hotel room he paid for with what remained of his money. He was 59 years old and still trying to rebuild his finances, pursuing small investments, looking for opportunities that never materialized. He visited the family in Hoboken occasionally, but the visits were strained. Hetty treated him with cold politeness, a kind of formal courtesy you might extend to a distant acquaintance. The marriage existed only on paper. They did not live together. They did not share finances. They barely spoke. Edward seemed to have accepted that he would never recover what he had lost, that his wife would never help him, that the rest of his life would be diminished. He moved through New York like a ghost of his former self. Hetty's wealth continued growing. The loans generated steady income. Her bonds paid interest like clockwork. Her rental properties produced monthly checks. She was worth perhaps $10 million by 1881, an enormous fortune, increasing every year. She lived on a fraction of the income, perhaps $500 annually, spending only what was absolutely necessary and reinvesting the rest. The children began to understand that their deprivation had no endpoint. This was not temporary hardship. Their mother would never decide they had saved enough, that now they could live comfortably. The saving itself was the point. The accumulation was permanent. Sylvia, at 10 years old, had never had a new dress. She wore Hetty's old clothes, cut down and resewn. She had never been to a party, never had a friend visit their rooms, never been invited anywhere because no one knew where they lived or how to reach them. Hetty moved frequently, changing boarding houses whenever she found cheaper rent, never staying anywhere long enough to form attachments. Ned watched his mother walk to Manhattan each morning in the same black dress, carrying the same carpet bag, looking like a widow or a clerk, despite having more money than most of the men she passed on the street. He began to feel something like shame, though he couldn't articulate it. Not shame about poverty. They weren't poor. Shame about the pretense, the performance, the insistence on living as if they had nothing when they had everything. Hetty noticed none of this, or chose not to. Her focus remained on the numbers, the interest rates, the collateral, the compound growth. She had returned to New York to manage her wealth more effectively, and she was succeeding. Her fortune was expanding. She was making successful investments. She was accumulating more. What she was not doing was building a home, creating stability, or allowing her children anything resembling a normal childhood. But normal was wasteful. Childhood was brief, money was permanent. She had made her choice about which mattered. Choice. Ned was 14 in 1882 when he injured his leg. The accounts vary on the exact circumstances. Some say he was playing with other boys in Hoboken, others that he was running an errand for his mother and slipped on ice. What is consistent is that he fell hard, striking his knee against pavement or stone, and the pain did not subside. Within days, the knee had swollen. He could not bend it without sharp pain shooting up his thigh. Hetty examined the injury herself. She had no medical training, but believed doctors were expensive and usually unnecessary. She told Ned to rest, to keep weight off the leg, that swelling would go down on its own. He stayed in bed for a week. The swelling did not decrease. The skin around the knee became hot to the touch, slightly discolored. Other mothers in the boarding house suggested she take him to a doctor. Hetty dismissed them. She said doctors charged outrageous fees for common injuries, that rest and time were sufficient treatment. One woman offered the name of a charity clinic that treated children for free. Hetty wrote down the address but did not go immediately. 2 more weeks passed. Ned's fever began, not high, but persistent. He lay in the small bedroom sweating through his nightshirt, asking his mother when the pain would stop. Hetty brought him water and cold compresses. She told him he was strong, that he would heal, that patience was required. Sylvia watched from the corner of the room, 11 years old and silent. She had learned by now not to question her mother's decisions, not to ask for things, not to express needs. But she saw her brother's face tightening with pain, saw him trying not to cry, and something in her understood that what was happening was wrong. Finally, nearly a month after the initial injury, Hetty took Ned to the charity clinic. She dressed him in his plainest clothes, wore her most threadbare dress, carried no purse that might suggest wealth. The clinic was on the Lower East Side, in a building that smelled of carbolic acid and unwashed bodies. It served the poorest families in the city, immigrants, laborers, people with no other options. The doctor who examined Ned was young, overworked, seeing dozens of patients each day. He looked at the swollen knee, felt the heat radiating from it, asked how long it had been injured. Hetty said a few days. The doctor looked at her, then at Ned, and did not challenge the lie. He said the injury had become infected, that it needed immediate treatment, possibly surgery. Hetty asked about the cost. The doctor explained that the clinic treated charity cases for free, but that surgery would need to happen at a hospital, which would involve fees. Hetty asked how much. The doctor gave an estimate. Perhaps $50, perhaps more, depending on complications. Hetty said she would consider it and took Ned home. She did not schedule surgery. She returned to the clinic several more times over the following weeks, bringing Ned for examinations, receiving the same advice, that the infection was worsening, that delay increased the danger, that he needed surgery soon. Each time she asked about cost. Each time she left without committing. The clinic doctors began to suspect she was lying about her financial situation. A nurse mentioned that the woman's dress was poor, but her bearing suggested education, that something seemed inconsistent. But there were too many patients, too many real cases of desperate poverty, and they could not refuse to see the boy. By late spring, the infection had spread into the bone. Ned's fever was higher now, sustained. He could not walk. The pain had become constant, a throbbing presence that never fully receded. Hetty finally agreed to let the clinic arrange surgery at Bellevue Hospital, the city's public hospital for the indigent. The surgery happened in June 1882. The doctor opened the knee and found extensive damage. The infection had destroyed tissue, compromised the joint, spread into the surrounding bone. He cleaned what he could, drained the infection, closed the wound. But the damage was done. The leg would never fully recover. Ned spent 2 weeks in a ward at Bellevue, surrounded by patients with typhoid, with injuries from factory accidents, with advanced tuberculosis. Hetty visited once. She brought no gifts, no books, nothing to ease the boredom and pain of recovery. She told him he had been brave, that the worst was over, that he should focus on healing so he could leave the hospital quickly. He was released with instructions to keep the leg elevated, to return for follow-up examinations, to avoid putting weight on it for at least another month. Hetty brought him back to the boarding house in Hoboken. She did not hire a nurse. She did not adjust their living situation to accommodate his immobility. He lay in the same narrow bed, in the same cramped room, trying to heal. The leg did not heal correctly. The infection had weakened the bone and damaged the joint permanently. As Ned tried to walk again over the summer, he found that the leg could not bear full weight, that it remained stiff and painful. By autumn, it was clear that he would have a permanent limp, that the knee would never bend normally again, that the delay in treatment had caused lasting damage. Hetty never acknowledged any error. She never apologized, never suggested that she might have acted differently. When Ned complained about the pain, she told him that pain was temporary, that he should be grateful the leg had been saved at all. When he struggled to walk, she told him to practice, to push through discomfort. That weakness was a choice. But the injury changed something in Ned. He began to see his mother not just as stern or frugal, but as dangerous. She had let him suffer for weeks rather than spend money. She had chosen her fortune over his health. He was 14 years old, and he understood that to his mother he was an asset to be preserved, not a person to be protected. Over the next few years, the leg worsened. The damaged joint became arthritic. The bone infection returned periodically, requiring further treatment. Ned's limp became more pronounced, and finally, in 1888, when he was 20 years old, doctors told him the leg could not be saved. The bone was dying. The only option was amputation. The surgery took place in New York. Ned lost his leg below the knee. He was fitted with a wooden prosthetic, heavy and uncomfortable, that he would wear for the rest of his life. He learned to walk with a cane, learned to manage stairs, learned to live with the physical reminder of what his mother's choices had cost him. Hetty paid for the amputation. By then she had no choice. The alternative was her son's death from sepsis. But she never spoke of the earlier injury, never acknowledged that the amputation might have been prevented if she had acted sooner, if she had spent the money when it mattered. Edward's last attempt to rebuild his fortune came in 1885. He was 64 years old and had been trying for more than a decade to recover what he had lost in the 1870s. He found an investment opportunity in a railroad venture, a regional line in the Midwest that needed capital to expand. The prospectus looked promising. The returns, if the railroad succeeded, would be substantial. He did not have enough money to invest meaningfully on his own. What remained of his wealth after the collapse was minimal, barely enough to maintain his modest hotel room and basic expenses. He came to Hetty and asked if she would consider partnering with him on the investment. Not a loan, a partnership. They would share the risk and split the returns. Hetty refused immediately. She had examined railroad investments before and considered most of them speculative traps. Too many variables, too much dependence on factors outside her control. Weather, labor disputes, competing lines, regulatory changes. She told Edward the investment was foolish, that he would lose whatever he put into it, that she would not attach her capital to his judgment. Edward tried to persuade her. He showed her the prospectus, walked her through the projected revenues, explained why he believed the line would succeed. Hetty was unmoved. She had watched him lose a fortune once through speculation. She would not finance him doing it again. He asked if she would at least loan him the money, at interest, with collateral. She refused that too. He had nothing left to offer as collateral that she considered valuable enough. His word meant nothing. His future returns were hypothetical. She did not lend on hope. Edward left that meeting diminished in a way he had not been before. There had always been some possibility, however faint, that Hetty might eventually relent, that some crisis or opportunity would lead her to help him. That possibility was now gone. She had made it clear. He was on his own. Permanently. He invested what little money he had in the railroad venture anyway. For a year, it seemed like the investment might succeed. The line began operations. There were positive reports about ridership and freight volume. Edward received small dividend payments. He wrote to Hetty about them, not gloating exactly, but wanting her to know that his judgment had been sound. Then the railroad failed. A competitor undercut their rates. A harsh winter damaged track that the company could not afford to repair. By late 1886, the line was insolvent. Edward's investment was worthless. The small dividends he had received were all he would ever see. He was 65 years old and financially ruined for the second time. Hetty's response was silence. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not need to. The failure confirmed everything she believed about speculation, about trust, about the foolishness of risk. Edward moved out of his hotel and into cheaper lodgings, a boarding house not unlike the ones Hetty chose, but his presence there carried different weight. She lived poorly by choice. He lived poorly because he had no alternative. They saw each other rarely after 1886. Edward would visit Ned and Sylvia occasionally, taking them for short walks or buying them inexpensive meals. The children were 18 and 15 by then, old enough to understand that their father was broken, that their mother had watched him break and done nothing. Ned, with his wooden leg and his cane, felt something close to kinship with Edward. Both of them had been damaged by circumstances that Hetty could have prevented, but chose not to. Ned never said this aloud, but it was there in the way he looked at his father, in the quiet conversations they had when Hetty was not present. Sylvia felt differently. She was developing a deep, unexpressed anger at her mother for the deprivation, at her father for his weakness, at the entire structure of their family that had left her at 17 with no education, no friends, no prospects, and no hope of escape. She was pretty in a severe way, with her mother's sharp features and her father's height, but no one saw her. They never went anywhere. She met no one. Edward's health began to fail in the 1890s. He developed a persistent cough that never fully cleared. He lost weight. His hair, which had been gray for years, thinned to near baldness. He looked elderly at 68, worn down not just by age, but by defeat. Hetty's wealth during this same period continued its relentless growth. She was worth perhaps $20 million by 1890. She had survived the panic of 1884 without losses. In fact, she had profited from it, buying distressed properties and bonds when others were desperate to sell. Her loan business expanded. Her real estate holdings increased. She moved between boarding houses and bank offices, still wearing black, still eating cold meals, still accumulating. In 1895, Edward became seriously ill. The cough was now accompanied by fever and difficulty breathing. A doctor diagnosed pneumonia. Edward was bedridden in his boarding house room, too weak to walk, struggling to breathe. Ned visited him daily. Sylvia came less often. She found it too painful to watch. Edward sent word to Hetty that he was sick, that he might not recover, that he would like to see her. She did not come. She sent a brief note acknowledging his illness and wishing him recovery, but she did not visit his bedside. She was busy with a property foreclosure that required her attention. Edward recovered from the pneumonia, but never regained his full strength. He spent the next several years in declining health, moving between boarding houses as his limited money ran out, occasionally staying with Ned when he could afford nothing else. He had become dependent on his son, who was himself dependent on an allowance from Hetty. The marriage had not been formally dissolved. Divorce carried social stigma that neither of them wanted, but it had been dead for decades. They were legally husband and wife, but they lived separate lives, occupying separate spheres, connected only by their children and a shared last name. In 1902, Edward Green died in a boarding house room in New York. He was 81 years old. The death certificate listed heart failure as the cause, but the deeper cause was longer and slower. 25 years of financial ruin, social decline, and isolation. Ned was with him at the end. Hetty was not. She attended the funeral, a small service with few mourners. She wore her black dress, the same one she always wore. She stood at the back of the church and left immediately after. She had work to return to, loans to manage, accounts to review. Edward's estate was negligible, a few personal items, some old clothes, a watch. He left no will because there was nothing to leave. Hetty paid for the burial, a simple plot with a modest headstone. It was the last expense she would ever pay on his behalf. Sylvia was 30 years old in 1901 when most women her age had been married for a decade, had children, had established households and social lives. She had none of these things. She lived with her mother, moving between boarding houses and temporary apartments, wearing old dresses, seeing no one. Her entire adult life had been spent in her mother's shadow, managing Hetty's correspondence, copying financial documents, serving as unpaid secretary and companion. Hetty had never enrolled her in school beyond childhood. She had never hired tutors, never sent her to finishing school, never introduced her to society. Sylvia had learned to read and write and calculate, but nothing beyond that. She knew nothing of music, of literature, of history, except what appeared in newspapers. She had never attended a dance, never been to the theater, never traveled anywhere that wasn't dictated by her mother's financial business. The isolation was deliberate. Hetty believed that education for women was unnecessary and dangerous. Unnecessary because Sylvia would inherit wealth that required no earning, dangerous because schools and social circles introduced influences Hetty could not control. Girls made friends. Friends made introductions. Introductions led to courtship, marriage, and the transfer of wealth to husbands and their families. Hetty had fought too hard to protect her fortune, to let her daughter give it away through marriage. So she kept Sylvia close, kept her occupied with clerical tasks, kept her away from situations where she might meet young men. Sylvia copied letters in neat handwriting. She organized receipts. She accompanied Hetty to banks and sat silently while her mother conducted business. There had been a brief period in Sylvia's early 20s when she had tried to resist. She had asked to attend social events, to visit relatives, to have some life separate from her mother's financial affairs. Hetty had refused each request. When Sylvia persisted, Hetty reminded her that she was living on Hetty's money, eating Hetty's food, wearing clothes Hetty provided. Independence required independent means. Sylvia had no means. The logic was airtight. Sylvia could not work. No respectable woman of her class could take employment without social disgrace, and Hetty would never have permitted it anyway. She could not marry without her mother's approval, and Hetty approved of no one. She could not leave because she had nowhere to go and no money of her own. She was trapped by the same wealth that was supposed to liberate her. By her late 20s, Sylvia had stopped asking. She had developed a kind of stillness, an absence of expectation. She moved through the boarding house rooms like a piece of furniture. She spoke when spoken to. She performed the tasks her mother assigned. She read books borrowed from libraries, the only entertainment Hetty considered acceptable because it was free. Ned, at least, had some freedom. He was a man, which afforded him liberties Sylvia could never have. After his amputation, Hetty had given him a modest allowance and some autonomy to manage small investments on her behalf. He traveled occasionally on business. He spent time in clubs, though never expensive ones. He had acquaintances, if not friends. His life was constrained, but it was not as completely controlled as his sister's. Sylvia watched him leave the apartment to conduct business or meet associates, and she remained behind with their mother, copying letters. She was developing a resentment that had no outlet, no expression. She could not confront Hetty. Her mother was impervious to emotional appeals, viewing them as manipulation. She could not rebel. Rebellion required resources. She could only endure. In 1903, when Sylvia was 32, a distant relative suggested introducing her to a suitable man, someone from a respectable family, who might consider marriage despite Sylvia's age and unusual circumstances. The relative wrote to Hetty proposing the introduction. Hetty declined. She said Sylvia was not interested in marriage, that she preferred to remain with her mother, that the family's interference was unwelcome. Sylvia learned about the letter months later accidentally while organizing her mother's correspondence. She saw the offer, saw her mother's refusal, saw that decisions about her life were being made without her knowledge or consent. She confronted Hetty that evening. The argument was brief. Hetty told her that the man in question was a fortune hunter, that his family was in decline, that he wanted access to the green wealth. Sylvia asked how her mother could possibly know that without meeting him. Hetty said she knew enough. All men who pursued wealthy women were fortune hunters. The conversation was over. Sylvia began to understand that her mother would never permit her to marry, would never allow her any independence, and would keep her as a permanent assistant until one of them died. The realization settled over her like a final verdict. She stopped speaking to her mother except when necessary. She performed her assigned tasks mechanically. She spent hours staring out windows at streets she never walked, at people living lives she would never have. She was 33, 34, 35, aging into spinsterhood in a series of rented rooms. Hetty seemed not to notice or not to care. She had her daughter's labor, which was useful, and her daughter's company, which prevented loneliness without requiring emotional intimacy. Sylvia's unhappiness was not Hetty's concern. Happiness was not a financial asset. It generated no income. The few relatives who still maintained contact with the family began to express concern. They wrote to Hetty suggesting that Sylvia should be allowed some social life, some opportunity for marriage, some existence beyond serving as her mother's clerk. Hetty did not respond to these letters. She considered them intrusions, attempts to influence her decisions, possibly schemes to access her wealth through her daughter. By 1905, Sylvia was 34 and had spent her entire adult life in a kind of house arrest. She had never been to Europe, never attended a ball, never had a suitor, never made a choice about her own life. She had watched her mother accumulate millions while denying her every small pleasure, every opportunity, every possibility of escape. Hetty was 71 years old, still active, still managing her investments with the same obsessive attention she had maintained for 40 years. Her health was declining slowly. She had dizzy spells, occasional chest pains, but she refused to see doctors, refused to slow down, refused to consider what would happen to her children after her death. Sylvia began to wait, not for anything specific, but for time to pass, for circumstances to change, for the imprisonment to end. She was developing a bitterness that would never fully heal, a sense that her life had been stolen from her by the person who should have protected it. And Hetty, counting her millions in cold apartments, reviewing her ledgers by dim light, seemed entirely unaware that she had sacrificed her daughter's entire existence to protect wealth that Sylvia would eventually inherit, but would never have the youth or opportunity to enjoy. By 1893, Hetty had established a permanent routine that would define the rest of her life. She kept no residence of her own. She rented rooms in boarding houses or cheap apartments month by month, sometimes week by week, always ready to move if she found cheaper accommodations. But increasingly, she simply stayed at banks. The Chemical National Bank in Lower Manhattan allowed her to use an office in their building. It was not offered out of generosity. Hetty kept enormous deposits there, and the bank valued her business. The office was small, unheated in winter, stuffy in summer. It contained a desk, 2 chairs, and a cabinet for her documents. She arrived each morning at dawn and stayed until evening, conducting her lending business from that desk. Men came to her there, businessmen who needed capital quickly, who had been refused by regular banks, who were willing to pay her rates. She interviewed them like a magistrate hearing cases. She asked about their assets, their debts, their business plans. She examined their collateral documents with a jeweler's attention to detail. Most of them left without loans. The few who received money signed agreements that heavily favored Hetty. High interest rates, short repayment periods, severe penalties for default. The panic of 1893 made her wealthier. The stock market collapsed in May of that year. Banks failed across the country. Businesses went bankrupt by the thousands. Unemployment reached 20%. People lost homes, farms, life savings. The crisis lasted for years. Hetty had cash when almost no one else did. She had avoided speculation, kept her wealth in bonds and mortgages and gold, and maintained liquidity. When desperate borrowers came to her during the panic, she had money to lend. The terms were severe. 15% interest was common, sometimes 20%. But desperate men signed desperate agreements. She foreclosed on properties throughout the 1890s. Borrowers who had taken her loans in better times defaulted during the Depression. Hetty seized the collateral, buildings, land, stock certificates. She acquired real estate across New York and New Jersey this way, properties that she would hold for decades, renting them out, collecting income, never improving them, never visiting them. The bank office became her home as much as any rented room. She ate lunch there, crackers and cheese she carried from boarding houses, sometimes cold oatmeal in a jar. She didn't heat anything. The bank had no kitchen facilities for her use, and she would not have used them if they existed. Heat costs money. Other financiers working in the same building found her presence disturbing. Here was a woman worth tens of millions of dollars, sitting in an unheated office, eating cold food from jars, wearing a dress that was visibly worn at the cuffs and collar. They could not reconcile the wealth with the deprivation. Some of them thought she was insane. Others thought she was performing some elaborate deception, though they could not determine what or why. Hetty was performing nothing. This was simply how she lived. The accumulation of wealth had become entirely separate from its use. The numbers in her accounts grew larger: $25 million, $30 million, approaching $50 million by the late 1890s. But her daily life remained unchanged. Same black dress, same cold meals, same rented rooms. Sylvia came with her to the bank office most days, sitting in the second chair, copying correspondence, filing documents. She was in her late 20s then, trapped in a routine as rigid as her mother's, aging silently in that unheated room. Men who came to negotiate loans sometimes looked at her with pity or confusion. She was well-spoken, clearly educated in some way, presentable despite her plain clothes. What was she doing serving as clerk to this strange old woman? Ned visited less frequently. He had developed his own small investment business, managing a portion of Hetty's portfolio, operating with some independence, though still ultimately controlled by his mother's approval. He had rooms in Manhattan, spent time at clubs, had acquaintances in the business world, but he was 40 years old, unmarried, living on an allowance from his mother despite being the son of one of the richest women in America. The panic of 1907 brought another wave of desperate borrowers. This panic was shorter but more intense. Banks collapsed in days. The stock market lost half its value in weeks. J.P. Morgan himself organized emergency loans to prevent total financial collapse. Hetty, once again, had cash. Once again, she lent it at exorbitant rates. There is a story from this period, possibly apocryphal but repeated in multiple sources, that the city of New York came to Hetty during the 1907 panic, seeking a loan. The city needed cash immediately to pay workers and maintain services. Hetty agreed to lend $1.1 million. She demanded interest rates above what banks would charge. The city, desperate, accepted. Whether or not that specific transaction occurred, it captured something true about Hetty's position. She had become a lender of last resort, someone who profited from crisis, who waited for desperation, and then extracted maximum return. She saw nothing wrong with this. Markets fluctuated. People made foolish decisions. Those who prepared and maintained liquidity deserved to profit from those who did not. Her daily routine never changed regardless of external circumstances, panic or prosperity, summer or winter. She woke early in whatever boarding house she currently occupied. She walked to the bank carrying her carpetbag of documents. She sat at her desk and reviewed accounts, met with borrowers, wrote letters to agents managing her properties. She ate cold food. She calculated interest by hand. In the evenings, she returned to her rented room and continued working by lamplight. She tracked every expense in personal ledgers, the cost of lamp oil, of bread, of streetcar fare on the rare occasions she paid it. She calculated the compound growth of her investments. She planned future purchases of bonds and mortgages. She had no hobbies, no recreations, no interests beyond the management of her wealth. She read newspapers for financial news. She attended no theater, no concerts, no social events. She visited no friends because she had no friends. Her entire existence had narrowed to the accumulation and protection of capital. Sylvia watched this and understood that her own life would be identical unless something changed. She would sit in bank offices and rented rooms, copying letters, growing older, waiting. The wealth that surrounded them, that defined their entire existence, provided nothing. Not comfort, not security, not purpose. It simply accumulated, a growing number that bore no relationship to their daily lives. By 1910, Hetty was 76 years old. She had been living this way for decades. The bank office, the boarding house rooms, the cold meals, the black dress. These were not temporary conditions or eccentric choices. This was who she had become, what the protection of wealth had required her to be. And the wealth kept growing, indifferent to whether anyone would ever use it. Ned was 42 years old in 1910, and he had never made a significant decision without his mother's approval. He managed investments for her, conducted business on her behalf, traveled to inspect properties she was considering purchasing. But every transaction required her authorization. Every expenditure came from accounts she controlled. He lived on an allowance she determined, adjusted at her discretion, revocable if he displeased her. The wooden leg slowed him, but did not stop him. He had learned to manage stairs, to walk considerable distances with his cane, to conduct himself in business settings without drawing attention to the prosthetic. But it marked him. Other men his age were establishing themselves, building independent careers, raising families. Ned was still functionally his mother's employee. He had wanted to marry several times. In his 30s, he had courted a woman from a respectable New York family. They had been introduced through business acquaintances, had spent time together over several months, had reached an understanding. Ned spoke to Hetty about his intention to propose. Hetty interrogated him about the woman's family, their financial situation, their social connections. She concluded that the family was in decline, that they saw Ned as a source of rescue, that the woman was marrying for money rather than affection. Ned protested that Hetty had never met the woman, could not possibly know her intentions. Hetty said she knew enough. She threatened to reduce his allowance to nothing if he pursued the marriage. Ned was in his mid-30s then, theoretically an adult capable of making his own choices, but he had no independent income. Everything he had came from Hetty. If she cut him off, he would be left with nothing. No money, no prospects, no way to support a wife. The woman he had courted learned of Hetty's opposition and quietly withdrew. The engagement never happened. There were other women over the years, other tentative courtships that ended when Hetty intervened or when the women learned about his financial situation and decided they could not marry a middle-aged man who lived on his mother's allowance. By his 40s, Ned had stopped trying. The pattern was clear. Hetty would never approve a marriage, would never relinquish financial control, would never allow him the independence that marriage required. He compensated in other ways. He spent money on things Hetty considered frivolous: fine cigars, club memberships, occasional dinners at good restaurants. He bought a motor car in 1908, one of the early automobiles, a luxury that Hetty found incomprehensible. She asked why he needed such an expensive machine when public transportation existed. He told her it was useful for business. She did not believe him, but did not forbid it because he purchased it with money she had given him for business expenses. The automobile became his escape. He drove through New York and into the countryside, away from his mother's boarding houses and bank offices, away from the narrow rooms and cold meals. He drove fast, recklessly sometimes, as if speed could create distance that geography could not. But he always returned. He had nowhere else to go. His entire identity was bound up in being Hetty Green's son, in managing her affairs, in waiting for the inheritance that would eventually make him independently wealthy. The waiting had consumed his 20s, his 30s, and now his 40s. Hetty seemed oblivious to what she had done to him. She saw him as successful. He was a competent businessman, managed significant investments, conducted himself well in financial circles. She did not see that he had no life beyond those functions, that every personal desire had been subordinated to her control, that he was approaching 50 years old with nothing that was truly his own. Ned began spending more time away from New York in the early 1910s. He took business trips that lasted longer than necessary, stayed in hotels, conducted transactions that could have been handled by telegram. Hetty complained about the expense but did not stop him. She needed him to manage certain properties and investments, needed his presence in meetings where a man's voice carried more weight than hers. In 1911, Ned was 43 and beginning to show signs of his own health decline. The amputation site caused chronic pain. The wooden leg had damaged his hip over years of uneven walking, creating arthritis that made movement increasingly difficult. He gained weight, partly from reduced activity, partly from the comfort eating that had become one of his few pleasures. He started to resemble his father, not in appearance, but in defeat. Edward had been broken by financial failure and Hetty's refusal to help. Ned was being broken by financial dependence and Hetty's refusal to let go. Different mechanisms, same result. Sylvia watched her brothers decline with recognition. They rarely spoke about their situation directly. Years of living under Hetty's control had taught them both to avoid confrontation, to express nothing that might be used against them. But they understood each other's predicament. They were both prisoners of their mother's wealth, both waiting for liberation that could only come through her death. That waiting created a horrible moral position. They could not wish their mother dead or could not admit to wishing it, but they also could not imagine freedom any other way. Hetty was in her late 70s, still vigorous, still managing her empire with obsessive attention. She showed no signs of slowing down. She might live another 10 years, another 15. Ned would be 60. Sylvia would be 55. Their lives would be over by the time they inherited. Ned began to drink more than he had in earlier years. Not heavily, not enough to interfere with business, but enough to soften the evenings, to make the waiting bearable. He sat in his hotel rooms or club chairs with whiskey, smoking cigars, reading newspapers, watching time pass. He had inherited his mother's head for numbers, her ability to calculate interest and assess value, her instinct for protecting assets. But he had not inherited her capacity to live for accumulation alone. He wanted things: comfort, companionship, pleasure, respect. He wanted a life beyond ledgers and loan agreements. Hetty had given him money but not autonomy, responsibility but not authority, a future inheritance but no present existence. She had shaped him into a competent manager of wealth while denying him everything that wealth was supposed to provide. By 1912, Ned was 44, unmarried, living in hotels, managing his mother's investments, driving his motor car on long solitary trips, waiting. The wooden leg that had resulted from Hetty's delayed treatment when he was 14 was now a daily reminder of what her choices had cost him. He carried it with him everywhere, a physical manifestation of the damage that care subordinated to money could inflict. And his mother, now 78, continued working from her bank office, reviewing accounts, foreclosing on properties, accumulating millions, entirely unaware that she had already foreclosed on her son's life. The telegram arrived in February 1909. A distant cousin had written to Sylvia directly, not to Hetty, but to Sylvia, inviting her to visit for a few weeks. The cousin lived in Vermont, far from New York, and suggested the change of scenery might be good for Sylvia's health. The message was innocuous enough that Hetty could find no clear reason to forbid it. Sylvia was 38 years old. She had never traveled anywhere alone, never spent a night away from her mother without explicit supervision. The invitation represented something she had stopped believing was possible: an opening. She accepted before Hetty could formulate an objection. She packed a small bag and took a train north. The cousin met her at the station, a woman in her 50s, widowed, living in a modest but comfortable house in a small town. They were not close relatives. They barely knew each other. But the woman had seen Sylvia once years ago and had been disturbed enough by what she witnessed to extend this invitation. The visit was supposed to last 2 weeks. It lasted 6. For the first time in her adult life, Sylvia lived in a house with heat, ate warm meals at regular hours, slept in a room with curtains and a comfortable bed. The cousin asked nothing of her: no letters to copy, no accounts to organize, no tasks. Sylvia could read, walk through town, sit by the fire, exist without purpose. The cousin introduced her to local families, to church socials, to small gatherings that Sylvia had never been permitted to attend in New York. And at one of these gatherings, Sylvia met Matthew Astor Wilkes. He was 41 years old, a businessman of moderate success, distantly related to the Astor family, though not wealthy by their standards. He was reserved, polite, pleasant-looking, in an unremarkable way. He had never married. When he met Sylvia, he saw a woman his own age, intelligent, well-spoken, obviously from a refined background, despite her plain dress. They began talking at the church social and continued the conversation over the following weeks. Sylvia returned to Vermont 3 more times that year, each visit arranged carefully, each one requiring negotiation with Hetty, who grew increasingly suspicious of her daughter's absences. Matthew courted her quietly. Walks, conversations, letters when she was back in New York. Hetty investigated him immediately. She hired agents to examine his finances, his business dealings, his family connections. The reports came back showing moderate wealth, no significant debts, no scandals. He was respectable, but not rich. Hetty concluded he was marrying Sylvia for money. Why else would a 40-year-old bachelor suddenly court a 38-year-old spinster? Sylvia did not care about his motivations. She was approaching 40, had never been courted, had spent her entire adult life in rented rooms serving as her mother's clerk. Matthew offered escape. That was enough. They became engaged in late 1909. Matthew proposed formally, and Sylvia accepted. She told her mother afterward, not before. The conversation was brief and cold. Hetty stated her objections, that Matthew was a fortune hunter, that the marriage was a mistake, that Sylvia would regret it. Sylvia said she was marrying him regardless. Hetty could not legally prevent the marriage. Sylvia was 38 years old, legally an adult, entitled to make her own decisions. But Hetty could make it difficult. She refused to provide a dowry. She refused to attend the wedding planning. She told Sylvia that if she married against her advice, she should not expect financial support beyond what Hetty chose to provide. Sylvia married Matthew Astor Wilkes in February 1910, a small ceremony in Vermont with few guests. Hetty did not attend. She sent no gift, no letter of congratulation, no acknowledgement. Ned attended as his sister's only family representative, giving her away in their mother's absence. The wedding was quiet, functional, lacking any joy or celebration. Sylvia was 38, Matthew was 41. They were middle-aged people entering marriage with the weariness of those who had waited too long for something that should have come naturally decades earlier. They settled in New York in a house that Matthew owned, modest but comfortable. For Sylvia, it was the first real home she had known since childhood. Heat in winter, a kitchen with a stove, furniture that belonged to her. Matthew was kind to her in a distant, formal way. They lived together like polite strangers, sharing space, but not intimacy. Sylvia did not love him. She was not sure she was capable of love after decades of emotional deprivation. But she was grateful to him for providing escape, for giving her a name and status that separated her legally and socially from her mother. She was Mrs. Matthew Astor Wilkes now. She had her own household. She was no longer Hetty's unpaid secretary. But the escape was incomplete. Hetty still controlled Sylvia's money, what little allowance she had always been given, and more importantly, her future inheritance. Sylvia was married, but she was not financially independent. She still needed her mother's approval for any significant expenditure. Matthew's moderate wealth was not enough to provide the lifestyle Sylvia had been raised to expect, even if she had rarely experienced it. Hetty visited once 6 months after the wedding, appearing unannounced at the house. She inspected the rooms with a critical eye, commented on wasteful expenditures, new curtains, a rug, small luxuries that Sylvia had purchased. She asked Matthew pointed questions about his business, about his debts, about his plans for the future. The visit lasted less than an hour. Hetty left without warmth, without reconciliation. Sylvia understood then that marriage had not freed her from her mother's control, only changed its form. She still depended on Hetty financially. She still lived under the shadow of her mother's judgment, and she knew that Hetty would use that control to punish her for the marriage, to remind her that independence was an illusion. The years that followed were strange ones. Sylvia tried to build some kind of social life, to join women's clubs, to entertain in her modest home. But she was 40 years old and had no practice in friendship, no understanding of how normal social relationships worked. She had spent her entire adult life in isolation. She did not know how to talk to other women about ordinary things: children, household management, social gossip. She had no children. Her household had always been managed by deprivation. Her social knowledge was non-existent. She attended events and sat silently, smiling politely, saying little. Other women found her strange, cold, and difficult to reach. Invitations became less frequent. Sylvia retreated into her home, into her marriage, into a life that was marginally better than what she had known, but still profoundly lonely. Matthew was often away on business. When he was home, they maintained a cordial distance. They slept in separate bedrooms. They took meals together in silence. They had married too late, both of them, and under circumstances that precluded real intimacy. Sylvia had gained a husband and a house. But she had lost her 30s to her mother's control, lost the years when marriage and motherhood might have been possible, lost the education and social development that would have prepared her for the life she was now trying to live. She was free, technically, but freedom at 38, after decades of captivity, felt less like liberation and more like exile into a world she no longer understood. By 1910, Hetty's wealth had grown to approximately $100 million. The figure was an estimate. Her assets were scattered across bonds, mortgages, real estate, railroad securities, and cash deposits in multiple banks. She refused to provide exact totals to anyone, including her own children, but financial journalists who tracked her transactions, who noted her property acquisitions and loan activities, calculated her net worth at somewhere between $80 million and $100 million. She had not invented anything to earn this fortune. She had not built a company, developed a technology, created employment for thousands, or contributed to industrial progress. She had inherited approximately $5 million in 1865 and had turned it into $100 million through 45 years of lending, foreclosing, buying distressed assets, and compounding interest. The wealth generation was almost entirely passive. She loaned money to desperate borrowers at high interest rates. They paid her, or they defaulted, and she seized their collateral. She bought bonds that paid predictable coupons. She purchased properties during economic panics when prices collapsed, then held them for decades collecting rent. The money accumulated through the mechanics of compound interest and the desperation of others. She employed almost no one directly. She had no staff, no office workers, no servants. She hired agents to collect rents from her properties, paying them minimal commissions and auditing their work obsessively. She hired lawyers when necessary to foreclose on defaulted loans, but she created no jobs, built no enterprises, developed nothing that had not existed before. Her wealth was extractive. It grew by taking from others, taking collateral from failed borrowers, taking rent from tenants, taking interest from desperate businesses. During the Panic of 1893 and again in 1907, when businesses failed and families lost everything, Hetty's fortune expanded. She profited from collapse. The tenement buildings she owned in Lower Manhattan were among the worst in the city. They housed immigrant families, factory workers, people living in desperate poverty. The buildings were overcrowded, poorly maintained, lacking basic sanitation. Hetty collected rent monthly through her agents, but refused to spend money on improvements. When tenants complained about broken pipes, collapsed ceilings, rat infestations, the agents told them to leave if they were unsatisfied. There were always more tenants. Demand exceeded supply. In 1911, a fire broke out in one of Hetty's tenement buildings on the Lower East Side. The building lacked fire escapes. They were not required when the building was constructed, and Hetty had refused to install them when later regulations made them mandatory for new construction. The fire started on the third floor and spread rapidly through the wooden interior. Residents fled down a single narrow staircase, some jumping from windows. 3 people died, 2 children and an elderly woman who could not navigate the stairs quickly enough. Several others were injured. The newspapers covered the fire, listed the property owner as Hetty Green. There were calls for investigations, for enforcement of building codes, for prosecution of negligent landlords. Hetty's response was silence. She issued no statement, made no appearance, offered no compensation to the families of the dead. Her lawyers handled the legal aftermath, arguing that the building met all codes in effect at the time of construction, that the fire was caused by tenant negligence, that the landlord bore no responsibility. The case settled quietly for a small sum that Hetty paid under protest. The incident did not shame her into improving her other properties. She continued to collect rent from buildings that barely met minimal safety standards, that housed people in conditions she herself would never have tolerated. The disconnect seemed not to register with her, that her wealth came partly from the suffering of people living in buildings she owned but never visited. She also held substantial railroad securities, bonds and stocks in lines across the country. Some of these railroads were known for dangerous working conditions, for paying minimal wages, for brutal suppression of labor organizing. When railroad workers struck in the 1890s and early 1900s, seeking basic safety improvements and fair pay, Hetty supported management positions. Strikes reduced dividends. Dividends were her income. Worker safety was not her concern. Her lending business continued through her 70s. Men still came to her office seeking capital. The dynamic was always the same. They were desperate. She had money. She extracted maximum advantage. Interest rates of 15 or 20%. Short repayment terms. Severe penalties for late payment. If they defaulted, she foreclosed immediately, showing no mercy, no consideration for circumstance. There were stories of borrowers begging for extensions, explaining that a family illness or a business delay had prevented timely payment, asking for a few more weeks. Hetty refused. The contract specified payment dates. Failure to meet those dates meant forfeiture. She seized properties, stocks, whatever collateral had been pledged, sold them quickly to recover her principal and interest. This was legal. This was how lending worked. But the severity of her terms, the absoluteness of her enforcement, the complete absence of human consideration, these things distinguished her from other lenders. Banks sometimes negotiated with troubled borrowers, extended terms, found solutions that allowed both parties to survive. Hetty never negotiated. The contract was the relationship. Violation of the contract ended the relationship and triggered forfeiture. Her philanthropy was non-existent. She gave nothing to charity, nothing to churches, nothing to cultural institutions. When approached by organizations seeking donations, she refused. She said charity encouraged dependence, that people should support themselves as she had supported herself. The fact that she had supported herself by inheriting millions seemed not to factor into this logic. Other wealthy families of her era, the Rockefellers, Carnegies, Astors, were beginning to establish libraries, universities, hospitals. They were engaging in large-scale philanthropy, partly from genuine conviction, partly to launder reputations built on ruthless business practices. Hetty did neither the ruthless building nor the philanthropic laundering. She simply accumulated. She was 76 years old in 1910, 77 in 1911. Her wealth continued growing even as she aged. She was earning money faster than she could count it, faster than she could find places to invest it. She kept large cash reserves in multiple banks, amounts so substantial that bank presidents courted her business, offered her special accommodations, let her use office space in their buildings. The fortune had become abstract. The numbers in her accounts bore no relationship to anything she could use or experience. She could not spend $100 million in her remaining years. She could not even spend the annual income it generated. The wealth accumulated beyond purpose, beyond utility, beyond any connection to human need or want. She sat in her bank office, now 77 years old, wearing a dress that was fraying at the seams, eating crackers from a tin, reviewing loan applications from desperate men, adding to a fortune that had long ago exceeded any possible use. The money required nothing from her now, except that she continued protecting it. And she did, every day, with the same obsessive attention she had maintained for 45 years, guarding wealth that no longer served any purpose except its own preservation. Hetty's first stroke happened in 1912. She was 78 years old, sitting at her desk in the Chemical National Bank, reviewing a mortgage agreement. The symptoms came suddenly. Her right hand stopped responding. The pen fell from her fingers. Her face drooped on one side. A bank clerk found her slumped in her chair, conscious but unable to speak clearly. They wanted to call a doctor. Hetty shook her head, tried to stand, collapsed back into the chair. The bank president came to her office, insisted that she needed medical attention, and offered to pay for it himself. Hetty managed to form words. No doctors. She sat in the chair for 2 hours, waiting for the symptoms to subside. Gradually, the sensation returned to her hand. Her speech cleared. The facial drooping lessened. She walked back to her boarding house that evening, moving slowly, leaning against buildings when dizziness struck. She told no one what had happened. She did not see a doctor. She took no medication. She went to bed in her rented room and woke the next morning with a persistent headache and slight numbness in her right hand. She returned to the bank office the following day. The clerks who had witnessed the stroke asked if she was feeling better, if she had seen a doctor. She told them she was fine, that it had been nothing, that they should mind their own affairs. She sat at her desk and resumed work as if nothing had occurred. But something had occurred. The stroke was a warning, her body announcing that it could no longer sustain the life she demanded of it. She had spent 78 years subordinating physical needs to financial priorities, eating poorly, sleeping in cold rooms, refusing medical care, walking miles to save car fare, maintaining stress levels that would have broken younger people. The body, after decades of deprivation, was beginning to fail in ways that will and discipline could not prevent. Over the following months, she experienced more symptoms, dizzy spells that forced her to grip the desk until they passed. Chest pains that radiated down her left arm, shortness of breath that made walking difficult. She acknowledged none of this to anyone. She continued her daily routine, boarding house to bank to boarding house, reviewing accounts, meeting borrowers, accumulating wealth. By 1913, the symptoms were worsening. She had developed a hernia, a painful protrusion in her abdomen that required surgery to repair. She refused surgery. She purchased a truss from a pharmacy, a device meant to hold the hernia in place, and wore it constantly despite the discomfort. The hernia did not heal. It grew larger over time, becoming more painful, restricting her movement. She also developed edema in her legs and feet. The swelling made walking increasingly difficult. Her ankles disappeared beneath puffy flesh. Her shoes no longer fit properly. She continued walking anyway, from boarding house to bank and back, limping now, stopping frequently to rest against buildings or storefronts. Ned noticed his mother's decline and urged her to see a doctor. She refused. She told him doctors were expensive and usually wrong, that bodies healed themselves given time, that medical intervention was for weak people. Ned pointed out that she could afford the best doctors in New York, that her wealth meant nothing if she would not use it to preserve her health. She did not respond to this argument. Wealth was not for spending. This was fundamental to her worldview. Using money to solve problems violated the entire logic of her life. Sylvia, now living with her husband in their own home, saw her mother less frequently. When she did visit, she was disturbed by Hetty's appearance. Her mother had aged dramatically in the past few years. The skin on her face had taken on a grayish color. Her hands trembled slightly. Her breathing was labored. Sylvia suggested doctors, specialists, and treatment. Hetty waved her away. The boarding house where Hetty lived in 1914 was on 9th Avenue, above a bakery. The rooms smelled perpetually of bread and pastry. Hetty rented a single room, no heat except what rose from the bakery below, no private bathroom. She shared a toilet down the hall with other tenants. She was 80 years old, worth over $100 million, living in a room that rented for $3 per week. She began having trouble with stairs. The climb to her third-floor room left her breathless and dizzy. Several times she had to stop halfway up, sitting on the steps until her breathing normalized. Other tenants, working-class families who knew nothing of her wealth, helped her on occasions when she looked particularly unwell. She accepted their assistance without thanks or explanation. In early 1915, she had another stroke, more severe than the first. This one happened in her boarding house room, late at night when no one was present to witness it. She woke in the morning on the floor beside her bed, having fallen during the night. The right side of her body was partially paralyzed. She could not stand without support. She lay on the floor for hours trying to move, trying to reach the door to call for help. Eventually, she managed to pull herself across the room using her left arm, inch by inch, until she reached the door and pounded on it weakly. Another tenant heard and found her. They wanted to take her to a hospital. She refused. They called Ned. He came to the boarding house, found his mother on the floor of a room barely larger than a closet, partially paralyzed, surrounded by her financial documents and ledgers. He insisted on moving her to his home. Hetty resisted initially but lacked the strength to prevent it. Ned hired a carriage and moved his mother to his townhouse on West 90th Street. He placed her in a bedroom on the second floor, hired a nurse despite her protests, and called doctors to examine her. The doctors confirmed what was obvious. She had suffered multiple strokes, her heart was failing, her kidneys were not functioning properly. The hernia had become strangulated and infected. Any one of these conditions was serious. Together they suggested she had perhaps months to live, possibly less. They recommended immediate surgery for the hernia, medication for the heart condition, complete bed rest. Hetty refused all of it. She told the doctors to leave, that she did not want their treatment, that they were trying to steal her money through unnecessary procedures. Ned dismissed the doctors but kept the nurse. Hetty remained in his home, in the borrowed bedroom, surrounded by comforts she had refused herself for decades. The room was heated. The bed was soft. Meals were brought to her at regular hours. She hated all of it. She tried to leave several times in the early weeks, attempting to get out of bed to return to her bank office, to her boarding house, to her routine. The nurse stopped her. Ned insisted she stay. Her body, finally, made the decision for her. She lacked the strength to walk, to dress herself, to leave the room. She lay in that bed through 1915 and into 1916. her fortune growing in banks across the city while her body slowly shut down, surrounded by a level of comfort she had spent her entire life refusing to provide for herself. The argument that killed Hetty Green began over a question of money. It was July 1916, oppressively hot in New York, and she had been confined to Ned's townhouse for more than a year. She was 81 years old, bedridden, her body failing in multiple ways simultaneously. But her mind remained sharp, focused on the only thing that had ever mattered to her. Ned had been managing more of her affairs as her health declined. He reviewed her accounts, made decisions about loan renewals, handled correspondence with her agents and bankers. He did this carefully, knowing his mother would scrutinize every transaction, question every decision. Even from her sickbed, she demanded daily reports, wanted to see every document, and insisted on approving every expenditure. On July 3, 1916, Ned came to her room with papers requiring her signature. A property in New Jersey needed repairs. The roof had partially collapsed, making the building unrentable until fixed. Ned had obtained estimates from contractors. The lowest bid was $500. He needed her approval to proceed. Hetty reviewed the documents from her bed, reading slowly, her vision deteriorating. She questioned the necessity of the repairs. Ned explained that without them, the building would generate no rental income, that tenants had already left, that the property was losing money while sitting vacant. Hetty wanted to know if they could patch the roof temporarily for less money. Ned said a patch would not hold, that the entire section needed replacement. The conversation escalated. Hetty insisted they could find a cheaper solution. Ned said he had already found the cheapest contractor willing to do the work properly. Hetty accused him of not trying hard enough, of being careless with her money, of making decisions that benefited contractors rather than her interests. Ned had spent 50 years enduring his mother's suspicions, her accusations, her unwillingness to trust his judgment on even minor matters. He was 48 years old, managing a fortune worth over $100 million, and his mother was arguing with him from her deathbed about whether to spend $500 to repair a roof. He raised his voice. He told her the repair was necessary, that he was not asking for her opinion, but informing her of his decision, that she needed to trust him to manage her properties competently. Hetty tried to sit up in bed, her face flushing with anger. She told him he had no right to make decisions without her approval, that this was her money, that he was acting like the fortune was already his. The accusation struck something in Ned. He shouted back that she was dying, that she could not manage her affairs from bed, that someone had to make decisions, and that he had been doing so responsibly for over a year. Hetty called him ungrateful, said he was waiting for her death, that he wanted her money more than her recovery. The nurse, hearing raised voices, came to the doorway. She saw Hetty struggling to get out of bed, her face dark red, her breathing labored. Ned was standing beside the bed, papers still in his hand, his own face equally flushed. The nurse tried to intervene, to calm them both, but Hetty waved her away. Hetty gasped, her hand going to her chest. The anger in her face shifted to confusion, then fear. She tried to speak, but the words would not form. Ned saw his mother's expression change and understood immediately what was happening. He called for the nurse, who rushed to Hetty's side. Hetty collapsed back onto the pillows. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. The nurse checked her pulse, racing and irregular. Ned sent for the doctor, who had been monitoring his mother's condition, though both he and the nurse understood there was likely nothing to be done. The doctor arrived within 20 minutes. He examined Hetty and confirmed she had suffered a massive stroke, possibly combined with a heart attack. Her blood pressure was critically high. Her pulse was weak and erratic. He administered what treatment he could, medication to lower her blood pressure, attempts to stabilize her heart rate. But the prognosis was clear. She was dying. Hetty remained conscious through most of the next day, though she could not speak or move her right side. She lay in the bed, eyes open, watching the ceiling. Ned sat beside her, the argument hanging between them like smoke. He had not meant to hasten her death, but he had argued with her, had raised his voice, had said things that triggered the physical collapse that was now ending her life. Sylvia arrived in the afternoon of July 3rd. She came into the room and saw her mother lying immobile, barely breathing, and felt nothing beyond a strange numbness. She had spent 28 years serving this woman, waiting for permission to live, aging into middle age in boarding house rooms and bank offices. Now her mother was dying, and Sylvia could not summon grief. She sat on the opposite side of the bed from Ned. Neither of them spoke. They watched their mother struggle for breath, watched the life drain slowly from her body. The nurse checked on her hourly. The doctor returned in the evening and said it would likely be soon. Hetty died just after dawn on July 4th, 1916. The nurse noticed first that her breathing had stopped, that the labored rise and fall of her chest had ceased. She checked for a pulse and found none. She informed Ned and Sylvia, who had both been sleeping in chairs beside the bed. Hetty Green died in a borrowed room in her son's house, a house she had never wanted to live in, surrounded by comforts she had refused for 80 years. She died arguing about money, unable to relinquish control even as her body failed, unwilling to trust even her own son with decisions about property repairs. The newspapers announced her death within hours. "Richest woman in America dies," the headlines declared. The obituaries estimated her fortune at $100 million, possibly more. They recounted her legendary frugality, her business acumen, her accumulation of wealth that exceeded that of almost any American woman of her era. None of them mentioned that she died in a fight about $500. None of them mentioned the daughter who had lost her youth serving her, or the son who had lost his leg and his autonomy to her paranoia. None of them mentioned the tenants who lived in her decaying buildings, or the borrowers crushed by her loan terms, or the life of pure accumulation that had consumed her completely. They reported her death as the end of a financial empire. They did not report it as the conclusion of a life that wealth had utterly failed to make meaningful. The reading of Hetty Green's will took place in August 1916, 6 weeks after her death. Ned was 48 years old. Sylvia was 45. They sat in a lawyer's office in Lower Manhattan, the same financial district where their mother had conducted business for decades, and learned that they would inherit everything. The estate was valued at $105 million, give or take a few million depending on current bond prices and property assessments. Divided equally between them, Ned and Sylvia would each receive approximately $52.5 million. They would be among the wealthiest individuals in America. They would never need to work, never need to worry about money, never need to deny themselves anything. The inheritance arrived 40 years too late to matter. Ned had spent his entire adult life waiting for this moment. He had subordinated every personal desire to his mother's control, had remained unmarried because she forbade it, had lived on an allowance despite being a competent businessman, had managed her properties and investments while she scrutinized his every decision. He had been 48 years old when she died. Most of his life was already gone. Sylvia had waited even longer in some ways. Her entire youth, her 20s and 30s consumed by service to her mother. Her marriage delayed until she was 38. Her social development arrested, her education denied. She had inherited enormous wealth at 45, an age when most women of her class were grandmothers, when their lives were established, when their identities were formed. Sylvia had neither children nor identity. She had money and nothing else. In the months following Hetty's death, both of them began spending, not extravagantly at first, but deliberately, as if testing whether the wealth was real, whether they were truly permitted to use it. Ned bought a larger house, then a country estate. He purchased more motor cars, began collecting them. He hired staff, butler, cook, groundskeepers, people whose sole purpose was to maintain comfort. Sylvia bought clothes finally, after decades of wearing hand-me-downs and resewn dresses. She hired a seamstress, then began purchasing from expensive shops. She redecorated her home, replacing Matthew's modest furniture with pieces that reflected her newfound wealth. She joined clubs, made donations that granted her access to social circles that had been closed to her. But the spending felt hollow. Ned, at 48, bought the motor cars he had wanted at 25. The pleasure was intellectual, not emotional. He understood he owned valuable objects, but they provided no joy. He drove them occasionally, showed them to visitors, but felt nothing. The desire had died during the decades of waiting. Sylvia wore expensive dresses to social events and felt like she was playing dress-up. performing a role rather than living a life. The other women at these events had learned social graces in their youth, had built friendships over decades, had developed the ease that comes from lifelong participation in their class. Sylvia had none of this. She smiled and said appropriate things and felt utterly alone among people who should have been her peers. Ned never married. His mother's death removed the obstacle, but it was too late for him to build the life he might have wanted at 30. He was nearly 50, set in habits formed by decades of restriction, uncertain how to form intimate relationships after a lifetime of keeping people at a distance to protect himself from his mother's interference. He began hosting parties at his estate, inviting business associates and acquaintances. The parties were elaborate, expensive food, good wine, entertainment. People came because Ned was wealthy and well-connected, but he had no close friends. The guests were cordial and left without intimacy. Ned stood in his own elaborate home, surrounded by people, and felt nothing. He gained more weight over the years following his mother's death. The wooden leg made exercise difficult, but the weight gain was also about comfort eating, about trying to fill an emptiness that food could not address. By his early 50s, he was significantly overweight, his mobility further impaired, his health declining. Sylvia's marriage to Matthew Astor Wilkes remained distant and formal. Matthew had not married her for love, and the inheritance did not change the emotional temperature of their relationship. They lived in the same house, maintained separate bedrooms, took meals together in silence. Sylvia now had money to redecorate and entertain, but she still had no one to share her life with in any meaningful way. She began charitable work, making large donations to hospitals and orphanages. The donations bought her recognition, plaques with her name, invitations to benefit dinners, acknowledgement from organizations grateful for her generosity. But she understood, somewhere beneath the surface, that this was not a genuine connection. People were grateful for her money, not interested in her as a person. Both Ned and Sylvia tried to give their lives structure through spending and activity, but the attempts felt performative. They had inherited wealth that should have provided freedom, opportunity, pleasure. Instead, it provided mostly the means to purchase things that did not satisfy and experiences that felt empty. Ned died in 1936 at age 68, his health destroyed by obesity, diabetes, and the complications of his wooden leg. He had spent 20 years as an enormously wealthy man and had found no purpose in any of it. He left no children, no significant accomplishments, no legacy beyond the dissipation of his portion of the fortune. Sylvia outlived him by 15 years, dying in 1951 at age 80. She and Matthew never had children, whether by choice or biology was never made clear. She spent her final decades making charitable donations, maintaining her home, attending social events with the same hollow participation she had begun in her 40s. She died quietly, and the newspapers noted her passing primarily because she was Hetty Green's daughter. Neither Ned nor Sylvia had found a way to transform inherited wealth into a meaningful life. The money had arrived too late, after the years when it might have opened genuine possibilities, after their characters had been formed by deprivation and control, after they had learned to live without expecting anything beyond survival. They had been freed from their mother, but not from what she had made them. Ned remained unable to trust, unable to form intimate relationships, unable to find pleasure in the comforts his wealth could buy. Sylvia remained emotionally constricted, socially awkward, uncertain how to exist in the world she had been kept from for so long. The fortune that Hetty had spent her entire life accumulating and protecting had failed to provide her children with anything except the means to live comfortably while feeling nothing. They had inherited millions and remained, in the ways that mattered, impoverished. Sylvia died childless in 1951. Ned had died childless in 1936. The Green family line, which had accumulated wealth across generations, ended with them. The $105 million that Hetty had protected so obsessively for 80 years dissipated within a single generation of her death. Ned had spent liberally in his final 20 years, on houses, cars, parties, collections of objects he barely used. When he died, his portion of the estate was significantly reduced. What remained went to distant relatives in various bequests. None of it stayed intact. The properties were sold. The collections were auctioned. Within a few years of his death, there was little physical evidence that Ned Green had ever existed beyond some legal records and newspaper clippings. Sylvia had been more conservative with her spending, retaining more of her inheritance, but she too left no direct heirs. Her will distributed the remaining millions to charities, to Matthew's relatives, to institutions. The money dispersed into dozens of streams, none large enough to carry her name forward. Hospitals received donations that funded wings eventually torn down or renamed. Orphanages closed or merged with other organizations. Within decades, the gifts were forgotten, absorbed into institutional budgets, disconnected from their source. The real estate that Hetty had accumulated, the tenement buildings, the commercial properties, the land parcels across New York and New Jersey, was sold off by Ned and Sylvia, or by their estates. The buildings that had generated rental income for decades changed hands, were renovated or demolished, and disappeared into the city's constant reconstruction. The addresses remained, but nothing about them suggested they had once been part of the Green fortune. The Chemical National Bank, where Hetty had maintained her office for so many years, eventually merged with other institutions and ceased to exist under that name. The building where she had sat at her desk, eating crackers from tins and interviewing desperate borrowers, was torn down in the 1920s. A new structure went up in its place. No plaque marked where Hetty had conducted business. No one remembered the old woman in black who had once been a fixture there. The boarding houses where she had lived, dozens of them across New York and New Jersey, were ordinary buildings before she arrived, and ordinary buildings after she left. Most of them were torn down or converted to other uses over the following decades. A few still stood in the 21st century, but bore no indication that one of America's richest women had once rented rooms there, eating cold oatmeal and mending her own clothes. Hetty herself was remembered, but largely as a curiosity. Newspaper articles appeared periodically about the Witch of Wall Street, recounting stories of her legendary frugality, eating cold food, wearing ragged dresses, living in poverty despite her millions. The stories treated her as an eccentric, an oddity, sometimes as a cautionary tale about miserliness taken to extremes. But the stories missed what had actually happened. They focused on the surface behaviors, the cheap food, the shabby dress, the boarding houses, and treated them as personality quirks rather than symptoms of a life constructed entirely around the protection of capital. They made her seem like a harmless eccentric, rather than a woman who had sacrificed her children's lives, her husband's dignity, and her own humanity to accumulate money that served no purpose beyond its own preservation. The tenants who had lived in her buildings, who had paid rent while living in dangerous, deteriorating conditions, left no collective record. They were immigrants and laborers, people whose individual stories were not documented, whose experiences were not considered historically significant. The fire that killed 3 people in her tenement in 1911 was forgotten within years. The families dispersed, the building was eventually demolished, and nothing remained to connect those deaths to the woman who had owned the property and refused to make it safe. The borrowers who had come to her office seeking loans, who had signed agreements at punitive interest rates, who had lost their collateral when they defaulted, these people also disappeared from the historical record. Their desperation had been Hetty's opportunity. Their failures had been her profit. But their names were not recorded, their stories not told, their losses absorbed into the general chaos of economic panics and personal bankrupts that marked the late 19th and early 20th centuries. What remained of Hetty Green by the 21st century was mostly mythology, stories about her frugality, perhaps exaggerated in the retelling, estimates of her wealth, impressive in historical context, but dwarfed by later fortunes. A few photographs showing a severe-looking woman in black, her face giving away nothing, and questions that had no clear answers. The questions historians and biographers asked were obvious ones. Why did she live in such deprivation despite her wealth? What drove her to such extremes of miserliness? Was she mentally ill, or was her behavior a rational response to some trauma or fear? But these questions missed the deeper ones. Not why she lived as she did, but what her life had cost the people around her. Not whether her behavior was rational, but what kind of rationality would sacrifice a son's leg to avoid medical expenses, would imprison a daughter for decades to prevent her from marrying, would profit from tenement fires and desperate borrowers without apparent conscience. The boarding house rooms where she had lived had been emptied, cleaned, and rented to new tenants within days of her leaving them. The desks where she had calculated interest and reviewed foreclosure documents had been cleared and used by other people for other purposes. The banks where she had kept her deposits had merged and changed and disappeared into corporate structures that bore no trace of her accounts. By the early 21st century, there was no physical location in New York where someone could stand and say definitively, Hetty Green was here. The buildings were gone or transformed beyond recognition. The bank offices no longer existed. The boarding houses had been demolished or renovated into modern apartments with no memory of their previous tenants. What persisted were the outcomes. Ned's wooden leg, result of Hetty's delayed medical treatment, had shaped his entire life, had marked him physically and psychologically, and then had been buried with him. Sylvia's lost youth, her decades of servitude, her loveless marriage and childless old age had ended with her death, leaving no descendants to carry forward any memory of what she had endured. The fortune itself, which Hetty had spent 80 years accumulating, had scattered to the wind within 35 years of her death. The money that had been the entire purpose of her existence, the organizing principle around which she had structured every decision and sacrifice, had failed to persist even 2 generations beyond her. The empty rooms, boarding house rooms, bank offices, tenement apartments, had all filled with other people, other purposes, other lives. The emptiness Hetty had left behind was not in buildings or bank accounts, but in the lives she had shaped and damaged. And those lives were gone too, leaving behind only questions about what wealth was for and what it cost, and whether any of it had mattered at all. Hetty Green died arguing about a roof repair. Her son lost his leg because she delayed treatment. Her daughter married at 38, too late for children, too late for the life she might have built. The fortune, $105 million in 1916, was gone by 1951. Dispersed to distant relatives and charities, absorbed into institutions that eventually forgot where the money came from. There is no green building at Harvard or Yale, no green hospital or green library, no foundation carrying the name forward. The wealth that consumed her entire existence left almost nothing permanent behind. The tenement buildings were sold or demolished. The boarding houses were torn down or converted. The bank offices where she worked no longer exist. By the 21st century, there was nowhere in New York to stand and say, with certainty, Hetty Green was here. What remains are questions without satisfying answers. What was she protecting the money from? What did she imagine would happen if she spent it? If she helped her husband? If she treated her son's injury immediately? If she let her daughter marry young? What future was she saving for that never arrived? She called it discipline, called it prudence, called it the difference between those who preserved wealth and those who squandered it. But preservation for what? Her children inherited millions and found they had inherited nothing that mattered. No capacity for joy, no ability to connect, no years left to build the lives that wealth should have made possible. The story persists as a cautionary tale about miserliness, about eccentricity, about a woman who lived like a pauper despite her riches. But that version is too simple, too comfortable. It suggests the problem was her personality, her psychology, her individual failure. The harder question is what the accumulation itself required, whether you could protect that much wealth, grow it relentlessly without subordinating everything else: health, family, human connection, purpose, whether the fortune shaped her or whether she shaped herself to serve it. Hetty Green died in a borrowed room, having spent 80 years ensuring no one could take what she had. She succeeded completely. No one took it. It simply dissolved after her death, as if it had never existed at all, which, in every way that mattered, it hadn't.